Hey there, Agile Rainbows and Sunshine, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bites, a podcast about what it means to be truly human and other things. Sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. We have been doing a series on the assumptions behind Little's Law, and this is the last one, which is either a cause of deep sadness or great celebration, depending on what your orientation has been toward this series so far. The first assumption that we looked at is that the arrival rate and the departure rate of your work need to match up. The second one that we looked at is any work you pull into the system needs to leave the system. The third one we looked at was that the amount of work in process should not be increasing or decreasing. The fourth one was that the average age of the work in process, the average age of the work you have in process, must not be changing meaningfully. It can't be increasing or decreasing. The fifth assumption, and our last assumption that we'll be looking at, is that consistent units must be used for all measures. This sounds a little bit different than the others, right? Because if you're looking at the other assumptions, they're all about controlling the flow. When do things come in? When do they leave? How long do they stay in the middle? But this is the first assumption that we've seen that is really more about math. It's really more about classifications. It's not so much about something you need to do with the work, but it's about how you talk about the work. It's about how you conceptually frame the work up. So we're going to talk about this a little bit because there's more packed into this little assumption than you might think. Because on the surface of it, it seems pretty obvious, right? We're talking about comparing apples to apples. And whenever you're doing a mathematical formula, then you need to use the same units of measurement the entire time. For instance, if I am trying to calculate how far I've traveled over a certain span of time, and I have miles and I have hours, then my result needs to be miles per hour, right? So I need to keep those units consistent in order for the math to work, in order for the math to be consistent. If I have one pizza and you bring over two more pizzas, I now have 3 rocks. No, of course I don't have 3 rocks. I have 3 pizzas, right? That doesn't make any sense. All of the units we've been working with is the pizza unit, which, by the way, I think we could put this whole metric British system to rest if we just use pizza as units of measurement. How many pizzas wide is this exactly? But then how would you measure pizzas? Okay, so now I have an idea for my next episode, but my point is that the units of measurement have to be consistent in order for it to mean anything, right? If I'm doing a calculation and my units are pizzas, then my result needs to be pizzas and vice versa, and not rocks or some other weird kind of unit that comes into it. So that seems pretty obvious, right? We all know that's how math works. It becomes a little less obvious, though, when we start looking at workflows and the metrics that we associate with workflows. Let me give you an example. Let's say I got 7 items done last week. So my throughput is 7 per week. Does that mean that I got 1 item done a day? Are those 2 statements interchangeable? They're not, right? Even though we know a week is 7 days, I cannot implicitly do that conversion because 7 items per week is not the same throughput as 1 item per day. Maybe I got all 7 items done on the last day of the week, or maybe I went 2, 0, 2, 0, 2, 1, or maybe I went 4, second day, and then a long period of time, and then 3. Those are all very different throughput runs, okay? But they all fall under the category of 7 items per week. Do you see what I'm saying? 7 items per week is not the same thing as 1 item per day, even though you can do some fancy math stuff and it seems like it should work, but it doesn't because I've changed the units. I am no longer talking about the same amount of underlying reality. What about this? Let's say, if you're a developer, we've all done this, right? So you're looking at a set of tasks and you're kind of thinking about how long it's going to take. And you're looking at the things you need to get done and you go, okay, well, I've probably got about 8 hours of work here. Does that mean you're going to get it done in 1 day? Every developer knows the answer to that question is no, of course not. Well, you've got an 8-hour day. Why wouldn't you get it done? Yeah, mathematically, that sounds like it should work. But now that I've transposed the units, I've made things a lot messier, right? Because those 8 hours are probably not going to happen contiguously in one day. So it's a fallacy to automatically transfer them into the other unit when we start talking about the actual flow of work, right? So 8 hours might be one day, it might be 2 days, it might be 4 days, it might be a week, it might be a month, depending on when we can get around to this and what other things might be going on, right? So it's very important, both from a mathematical formula perspective and from a dealing with the reality of workflow perspective, that whatever it is we're doing when we're doing our calculations with things like wait time and throughput and the amount of things we have in progress, that whatever units we use, we stay consistent with those units. Now, you may be sitting over there listening to this, and you may be thinking, this is the most obvious and trivial thing I think has ever come out of Phil Ledgerwood's mouth in podcast format. Well, first of all, joke's on you, because I say a lot of obvious and trivial things in this podcast. So obviously you haven't been listening enough. But the second thing is, it seems obvious and trivial, but I don't know that it always affects us at a practical level when we start thinking about how we want our work items to look and how we want our planning around them to look. So let me give you an example. I was working with an organization one time. They were doing Scrum at the time. We were in sprint planning and we were decomposing items and things like that. And we had a user story, and I don't remember what the user story was at the time, but the team decided the story was too big and they began to decompose it. And what they decomposed it into was, one story was about doing the UI, another story was about doing the middle tier, another story was about doing the database tables, another story was about doing the validation. They had basically sliced this story up by what I would call subtasks. You could say by application layer, but it wasn't even that, really. I mean, it sort of worked out that way, I guess, but really just sort of anything that needed to be done kind of became its own card. Now, from a team getting their work done perspective, maybe that's not that bad. You know, I would say at that point, they're not user stories anymore, but that's okay. They're work items. They're items of work that need to be done. But here's the problem. If your work items look like that and the units have to stay consistent, then any forecasting that I do also happens at that level of granularity. So my question to you is, are those forecasts useful then when you are communicating to clients or stakeholders or users or anyone who has a vested interest in what your forecast looks like? Well, if it does, then by all means have at it. But I have found that generally speaking, people outside of the development team tend to be interested in delivered value, right? So having the database tables done they don't really care about that. They don't need to know, oh, I should have those database tables done in 2 days. They want to know, like, when is this feature going to be ready, right? Or when can I finally get to use this particular business capability, right? This item of business value. That's what our discussions are generally around with the larger organization. And that's why we run forecasts at all, really, so that we can get some idea of when we can get this value into people's hands and when we can start getting feedback. So that's why this concept is more important than it might seem on the surface, because within the confines of my own team, it may work perfectly fine to break every work item down into this subatomic particle of work that ultimately turns into a product. But then when I'm doing my analysis of throughput and WIP and making projections and studying the impact of improvements, that's the level I'm stuck at. So if I do a forecast, say, for my stakeholders, what can we get done in the next 2 months? Then the only thing I can really tell them with confidence is, well, you know, over the next 2 months, we will complete 40 subtasks. You know, we will get 40 things done that are around the level of database tables and UI elements and validation, JavaScript, and, you know, API endpoints. Is that going to tell them what they need to know? Well, in some situations it might. And if it does, then have at it, right? Organize around that level of granularity. I have just generally found that in most organizations, that information is not useful, or it's not super useful. And if you want to produce useful information, both for yourselves and the larger organization, then you really want your work items to be of a unit that will be meaningful to them, which generally for us at Integrity tends to be user stories. User stories are the smallest deliverable, valuable item that we can turn over to the business. Now, does that mean every single work item we ever do is a user story? No, it doesn't mean that. But it just means that that's really going to be our default. That's what we are going to track from a workflow perspective. When we talk about WIP, we're talking about the number of user stories that are in progress, right? When we talk about throughput, we are talking about the number of user stories completed over time. When we talk about cycle time, we are talking about how long was a user story in the system. We are not tracking this at the subtask level, nor most of the time are we tracking this at some higher level of classification, like, epic level or project level, although we could, and there have been times when we have done that, and you can. Again, though, it comes down to using consistent units all the time, right? So if I'm forecasting the completion rate of features, then my work items need to be features, and all my workflow stuff needs to revolve around that. If it's user stories, it needs to be user stories. If it's tasks, it needs to be tasks. If it's projects, it needs to be projects. You need to keep the same units, apples to apples. I would recommend that you organize around the unit that is most cogent to your organization, because unless this information is solely for your team, you want to have a conversation that's meaningful to everybody and useful to everybody. For us, we've generally found that it's user stories. By the same token, you also need to choose your time based on the time units that you want to use when you are talking about these things. What is intelligible to the rest of the organization when you're having these conversations? What unit of time is valuable when you're doing planning or when you're communicating when people will have value delivered, when you're talking about the level of investment the organization is going to make into a feature or something like that? What unit of time is meaningful? Is that unit story points? Probably not. Is that unit number of sprints? Potentially, right? Depending on the exploratory nature of the product and how the business is funding it and setting goals and things like that. It might be number of sprints, right? And if it's number of sprints, then that's the units that I'm going to track, right? How many sprints, how many stories did we get done per sprint, for example? And do we have any stories that took more than one sprint? And I'm going to articulate that information so that the sprint becomes my unit of time, right? Generally speaking, I have found that whether you are in a Scrum environment or not, the unit of time that is generally most meaningful to everyone is days, number of days. How many days will it take to get this done? What day can we expect this to be ready for release? What day should I tell my marketing department these 10 features are going to be available to our beta users? It's the number of days that most organizations tend to revolve around. And that is why when we are looking at throughput and cycle time and WIP and things like that, we look at items over days. We have found user stories over days tends to be the most cogent to the most people. So it's something for you to think about. Now, that doesn't mean that's the case in your specific situation. I'm urging you to figure out what that is. If it's not user stories and days, what is it? Is it user stories and sprints? Is it tasks and hours? Is it projects and months? What are the units that serve as cogent planning and conversation and value-laden units for the purposes of discussion for the whole organization? And anyone who has had I don't know what you'd call it, highly unpleasant experience of trying to articulate to a stakeholder in story points when they can expect things, you've probably run into this wall, right? There's a disconnect between the units that you've been using internally as a team to make projections and then communicating those projections out to stakeholders. Now, some of you have probably figured this out, right? And you're like, yeah, we figured out story points convert to time or converts to sprints, and we do some math and it all works out. That's great. But when we're talking about Little's Law and the predictability of workflow, we want to use consistent units. It doesn't matter what the units are, we just have to use those units throughout with all of our tracking, all of our calculations, and all of our forecasting, if our forecasting is to be reliable. So you can really pick any units you want. I just highly advise you to pick units that are going to be the most meaningful and valuable to everyone that you talk to in the organization to whom this information is valuable. For us, it's usually user stories and days. For yours, your mileage may vary. So I actually find this assumption to be kind of thought-provoking, really, because not only do you need it for the math to work, but it really causes you to think about, well, how do we track our work items? What is a work item for us? And what unit of time are we going to use to track our progress on these work items? And how will that affect the way we communicate to the larger organization? And I think that you will have a really good discussion with your team. Honestly, even your tool selection, your project management tools or your ALM or whatever are going to be influenced by this discussion. So I highly recommend that you spend some time thinking about this assumption, thinking about the units that are meaningful in your discourse to the larger world, and then kind of reorganizing your tracking and your breakdown and your reporting, et cetera, around those units. Because if you are using consistent units throughout, then your forecasts are going to be meaningful and stable and reliable. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.